on a sec. No, I can't hear Amber.
Yeah, welcome to the Tabadlab Roundtable number 18, and we're going to be talking about the new social media rules as they've been called. Full name, of course, is the Removal and Blocking of Online Content Rules and Procedures 2020. It's just been issued, and there's already been a lot of criticism and critique on these rules and how they will impact freedom of expression, the tech industry. There have been reactions from civil society, from digital rights organizations, as well as the coalition which represents tech companies, which is the Asia Internet Coalition as well. So we're broadly going to be talking about whether these rules, how far-reaching their impact could potentially be. We're going to be talking about the impact on both freedom of expression and business, but also I think it's really important to talk about how these rules, how we can contain these rules, in the sense if there's misuse, what citizens can do, what lawyers can do, what human rights organizations and digital rights organizations and Parliament, most importantly, can do to prevent further misuse. I will now just introduce my panel. We have a really fabulous panel that really can talk about all these issues from every perspective. We have Taimur Malik, who's a lawyer. He's a partner at a leading international firm. He's the founder of Pakistan's leading law and justice initiative, which is called Courting the Law. And he is also a patron of the Youth General Assembly of Pakistan. We have Wahaj Siraj, who is the CEO and co-founder of Nayatel. And it's the first company, I mean, anybody in Islamabad and Rawalpindi uses Nayatel. So it's the first company to start fiber broadband in Pakistan in 2005. Mr. Siraj has been part of teams and launched Pakistan's first ever broadband network in 2002. And I understand internet providers have also raised their concerns about these new rules. We have Nighat, who is the executive director of the Digital Rights Foundation, and she's one of the pioneer women's rights activists in Pakistan. And we know how crucial and pivotal Nighat's role has been in terms of digital rights in Pakistan. And she's been involved in everything, whether it's the Pakistan Electronic Crime Act as well, and has raised her voice consistently. Similarly, we have Usama Khilji, who's also a digital rights activist, a human rights activist. He is the director of Bolo, an advocacy, policy, and research organization focused on internet policy and safety in Pakistan, also regularly writes columns. And last but not least, we have Mosharraf Zaidi, who is the founder and senior fellow at Tabadlab, wide experience in terms of public policy and is has well known for his work with Alif Elan as well, an education advocacy group. Thank you so much for taking our time on a Sunday. And I realize that this is a Sunday when everybody wanted to relax, but I think these social media rules has actually created quite the furor. In the sense that there have been reactions from across the board. Anybody who's a stakeholder in terms of digital Pakistan, there has been some muted reaction from what I would think is representatives of the government as well. But we'll get to that later. First of all, I'd like to start with you, Usama. What are sort of the broad issues that we're looking at? What are your concerns as a digital rights activist?
Thank you, Amber, and thank you to Tabadlab for organizing this and so quickly as the rules came out. There are some fundamental issues regarding our basic constitutional rights of freedom of speech, right to information, and right to privacy. So when we look at the rules, what they're essentially doing is they're trying to define these standards above the standards that companies already have to censor content on the internet, which includes blocking and removal of content. So essentially, it's the government and the state, and specifically the PTA, that gets to decide what they think is unlawful online content. And when you look at the definitions, they've really given the power to the PTA to have the ability to interpret constitutional language as well as language of the criminal code without any trial. And secondly, the major issue of privacy violation is there in these rules, because they're trying to get social media companies, internet companies, and also internet service providers to decrypt and data and hand it over to the FIA and give the FIA access to all internet related information and data of all internet users in Pakistan, including of the ISP. So that's really raises concerns regarding surveillance. And I think these two issues will tend to have a chilling effect on freedom of expression and privacy in Pakistan, which will really impact, thirdly, the main very important right to information, where a lot of websites are blocked, a lot of content on social media is blocked for viewership within Pakistan. And essentially, the government and the state will have the ability to control the narratives online, which will really detrimentally impact the ability of Pakistani citizens to criticize state policies. And if you look at the language, they're really giving the power to PTA to also censor content that intimidates or harms the reputation of government officials or the government itself, which can really be abused by the state. And we've seen a lot of precedent of that in the recent past. Now, what they're also saying is that if social media companies and ISPs do not comply with orders of censorship from the state, the state has the power to block the entire platform. We saw how TikTok was blocked recently, and we've seen how YouTube was blocked for 4 years in Pakistan. So the precedent for this already exists. And we've also seen the misuse and abuse of PICA against activists, against journalists, against human rights defenders, and against opposition political parties. So in that sense, it really consolidates all of these crackdown on democratic rights that we've seen in the past few years.
All right. Thank you, Usama. So many concerns here, and we'll talk about them in a little more detail, break them down a little bit. But I'd like to turn to Wahaj Siraj, because you mentioned ISPs, and one of the rules is that internet companies, PTA can issue instructions to block certain content. And ISPs, tech companies, have about 6 to 24 hours to comply with those instructions. What are the concerns of internet service providers? I think your mic is muted.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The prime concern of the businesses is that the red tape and the regulations keep increasing. Whether it is in the form of the Prevention of Electronic Crime Act. When it wasn't there, when it came in 2005-6, then there was a lot of hue and cry. A lot of innocent professionals were made victim to it. Then the act was taken down. Then again, after some years, it was again passed as a law. And the prime concern is that the telecom operators and the licensed ISPs, who are already very tightly and stringently regulated, they are subject to more and more regulation with the passage of time. And instead of easing the regulations, and instead of making the life of the businesses easy, government always tries to make their lives difficult, and basically that is increasing the difficulty of business. So more and more compliance restrictions means more overheads, more cost, and more difficulties. uh, I think about 3 months back, we received this order of CDN blocking. This content delivery networks that we operate, and those CDNs are operated by the large foreign companies like Google, like Facebook, like Netflix, and others. So we received an order that the CDN blocking is the responsibility of the local telecom operators. And we told we told that the regulator that this is none of our concern, because we don't have any control over CDNs. But because government always try to act so trigger happy and to so control freak that they want everything to be controlled, to be tightly regulated, and eventually they want to strangulate all the businesses, all the freelancers, all the content creators which have access to the internet, and who are actually making their I mean, who are making some of the money from creating good content and spreading on the internet. The all the telecom operators are already are already complying to the lawful intercept, so which means the li compliant, which we are required under the law. But the subjecting the ISPs to the more harsh regulation and to inspect each and every packet that we are just delivering from the content provider to the customer. So we are now expected to inspect each and every content and make sure that every content which is delivered through our networks is in so that content is in compliant with PICA, that is compliant with the Constitution of Pakistan, and that is compliant with the Pakistan Penal Code, and that is compliant with the anti defamation laws. So this is something which is not our mandate. Because we actually provide a conduit of the packet coming from the content providers to the customer, and now they are expecting us that we would deploy the mechanism which would inspect each and every packet and also ensure that the only lawful packets are and contents are delivered to the customers. That is actually totally absurd. The one thing that is technically very difficult to implement,
Hmm.
it is very costly to implement, and if we implement that, the network speed actually slows down. So that is actually choking the whole country's internet and making it a narrowband service that actually we used to deliver, say, 20 years back. So actually that is like pushing the whole sector and the whole broadband users into the dark age. So this is something that we have been trying to make government understand that, look guys, you are here to make regulations that are in line with the fast changing requirement of the technology. Technology changes very fast. Technology changes, overnight. The regulation has to be so they has to be in line with the changing technology. Number one, they have to make the lives of the small and the medium and the large businesses easy and not difficult. But I think we are actually seems to be moving into the reverse gear actually.
But then that begs the question, weren't stakeholders consulted? There have been multiple consultations on these rules and regulations. It sort of contradicts also this government's policy of digital Pakistan as well.
Yeah, my answer is no, plain no. None of the licensed telcos in Pakistan, who are contributing billions of rupees in the form of tax, who are contributing into the millions of new jobs creation, and who are contributing to provide, great digital infrastructure in the country, none of them were consulted. So the all the consultations happened behind the back doors, closed door. So nobody knew what was going on, and finally one day these rules are enforced, notified, and now we are here that okay, now they are the rules, now you have to comply these rules and regulations.
So a bit of a sort of stick, actually. These rules are, well, here are the rules. You must comply. You don't really have a choice. Is that the case, Taimur? Because, we do know that under a PICA, Section 37, the government did need to frame rules and a mechanism for managing online content. Does it? This is not the sort of what I'm hearing is that some of these are over and above. They're you could even call them, I wouldn't say illegal because these are framed by the government, but how much do they comply with the Constitution? What is above the law?
I think, Amber, you wouldn't be very wrong if you were to call it illegal as well, because there are mechanisms by which legislation or delegated legislation, as is the case here, has been declared as being illegal by the courts in Pakistan. In this case, a better term to use perhaps would be that this is bad law. The main legislation required the federal government to issue and notify rules. In this particular case, in February this year, a version of these rules was approved by the federal government. And after the Mustafa Impex judgment by the Supreme Court in 2016, federal government is the cabinet of Pakistan, including the prime minister. It's not the prime minister acting alone. It's not the federal cabinet acting without the prime minister or any particular minister or ministry. It is a combination of the entire cabinet and the prime minister. So in February, a version was approved. That version, to my understanding, included other things such as the concept of a national coordinator. That's not the case in the rules that we have in front of us today, which have been notified last month but made available only recently. So my first, as a lawyer, I would like to see whether they are indeed good law, or as I said, they are bad law. So the first thing would be to see, did the federal government actually, which is the cabinet, actually consider this current version of the rules and approved it prior to it being notified. If that's not the case, the discussion stops there. These are not properly notified rules. If it was done through the cabinet and then these were notified and gazetted, then the question would be that, and for once, let's not discuss about whether there was any consultation done with the private sector stakeholders. I think it's equally important that that sort of consultation should be done with public sector stakeholders as well. This is not something that you can look at in isolation only from the perspective of the PTA, for example, or a particular ministry. But there are elements, as Wahaj Sahab mentioned, which relate to the Ministry of Commerce, the Board of Investment, the Ministry of Science and Technology, even the Prime Minister's office has a Prime Minister's delivery unit looking at different things in how to encourage foreign investment, but also how to increase the knowledge economy in Pakistan. If all these things are to be done, there needs to be some evidence that that kind of debate and discussion was done even at the public sector level. So when these rules are finally challenged before appropriate forums in the courts, I think these questions will be considered. Did the federal cabinet consider and specifically approve the current version of the rules? Was there a discussion on these with public sector stakeholders, and were those comments taken on board? Or is it merely a draft that was prepared by somebody at some point in time, and a few amendments have been made to it here and there, and it's been notified? As a lawyer, I would also like to say that I think it's important that we have an open debate on these things. There is a right to information, and we should know who drafted these. Or were these drafted by some bureaucrats, or were these drafted actually by some lawyers? And if they were drafted by the lawyers, I think we should encourage those lawyers, and if anybody listens to this discussion, to come and have a debate with us and explain what is the rationale and how do they consider the current version of the rules to be in line with the Constitution of Pakistan, the principles of natural justice and human rights, and as well as the primary legislation in this respect. I think I'm smiling, but I don't think these rules will last long.
Well, you sound very hopeful, Taimur. Nighat, we know that in February, the government of Pakistan had notified rules. There was a lot of objections. Taimur talked about the national coordinator. That seems to have been removed. So somebody was listening. Meanwhile, there have been a series of consultations that didn't go anywhere, including a boycott. And suddenly, as all the participants have pointed out, these rules were notified without an understanding of the impact, perhaps again because stakeholders across the board weren't consulted. What was the need for a boycott? Perhaps maybe civil society and stakeholders should have been at least involved in whatever capacity they could have been.
Yeah, I think, Amber, that's a very good question. Why we boycotted? Because of our prior experience with the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. The rules are not the first instance where, civil society organizations or digitized organizations just, suddenly said, oh, we don't want to be part of the consultation. There is a history behind this. And as Usama mentioned, there are a number of challenges and issues with the rules. I think we really need to look into the all right, I cannot pronounce this word. But anyways, the legality of Section 37, because that was also challenged during our consultations in the previous government when they proposed Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, and the arbitrary powers that were given to the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority to remove and block content was something that was discussed at length. So our boycott, the decision of boycotting these rules were based on actually Section 37, that it shouldn't have been there. That section had to go. And I know that some groups challenged some parts of Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, but at the same time, during the hearing of Awami Workers Party website blocking, the court said that the Section 37 subsection 2 basically says that the authority has to make rules. So the PTA basically used, the PTA and ministry used that particular sort of excuse to make these rules also, and push that process really quickly. And our decision was basically based on the very basis of the Section 37 under which these rules are made. So the question around whether the consultation, the good consultation happened, or all multi-stakeholder, like it was multi-stakeholder consultation or everyone participated, that's not even a question. The question is that your parent act has problem, and those problems were never addressed. So the very foundation of these rules were never corrected by the previous government, and then this government. And then there are like number of problems with the rules itself, but I really don't want to even go there, because as Taimur mentioned, and he said that yes, he's a little optimistic these rules should go because of the illegality, or maybe it's a bad law, but even the foundation of these rules are just unconstitutional, I would say. Yeah, and then there are a number of things with the rules, the excessive powers of the authority, the review powers, and also under Section 37, I would say that it was basically, it was a copy paste of Article 19 of Constitution, right? And that is basically judicial power that you are giving to the executive body, which is PTA. So there are a number of problems with the rules, but the very foundations of these rules are actually unconstitutional, I would say, to that extent.
The very foundations of these rules are unconstitutional. And I think all of our participants here, Mosharraf, have spoken about the process. And I think it's important to go through the process where a consultation is absolutely key. But I think Taimur raised another very important question. So who framed these rules? Who made these rules? What should the process be?
Well, first of all, just on process, because, in the interests of full disclosure, as far as I understand it, the PTA was tasked by the committee that was notified to review the original social media rules. The PTA was tasked to conduct consultations. As far as I'm aware, there were only 2 group consultations. One was with civil society, the other one was with a group of journalists. Interestingly enough, I was invited to the civil society consultation, and I saw the list, and I saw Usama, and I saw Nighat, and I was like, great, we'll all go, and I'll sort of do what I do, which is I'll try to bridge the distance between the one side and the other side. But when I got to the consultation, I discovered that neither Nighat nor Usama nor anybody else from civil society was there, because they had boycotted. So I was kind of the only one, which was great for me because I got to speak more. And you know how much I love to do that. My position there is kind of, the same position I would take here. I think that all of the issues, particularly the issue of the spirit of the PECA law, right? And Article 37, the designation of a regulatory authority being given executive function over what should be something that is non-partisan. So let me explain this point, because I think Nighat spent many minutes, almost hours, explaining this to me, and I think that really merits some consideration. The foundational issue, it seems to me, that civil society has, among many other issues, it's not the only one, is that the very basis of the PTA running the show on this is being challenged, and so a lot of folks who feel strongly about due process and who have the experience when the PMLN government was framing the PECA laws, they've gone through the long experience of going back and forth with the government and discovering that the government wasn't really listening. Article 37 essentially gives PTA this kind of arbiter's powers without considering that the PTA itself is a regulator. Part of the PTA's job is to protect the consumer and the ISPs and Facebook and Twitter. So this is really important. If you read regulatory, and this goes for NEPRA, it goes for OGRA, is a standard regulatory practice, partly because it's drawn from the neoliberal sort of tradition. But basically, the regulator is there to protect the ordinary consumer, customer, citizen, whatever you want to call them, but it's also there to protect businesses. In order for PTA to do its legal role, it's very important that PTA is not a party in any conflict. By becoming the arbiter or the executioner of the PECA law, and in this case, these social media rules, there's no way PTA can protect. For example, PTA can't protect Wahaj on the one hand and beat Wahaj with a stick on the other, right? So we have to figure out on social media rules whether you need a separate regulator, or you need to revisit the PTA's establishment, or you need to revisit PECA. So I think that's the kind of legal and really foundational philosophical challenge. My challenge to Nighat and to Wahaj and to Usama and Taimur and to you, actually, Amber, and to anyone listening, is actually a little bit different, which is the basis for this, for these social media rules, is the basis not one that we can consider? Is the government completely baseless in wanting to control some content, notwithstanding that it goes too far in many cases, and I think it does go too far, but are there should there be no holds barred? And more importantly, when the government tries to reach Twitter or reach out to Facebook, and for example, I think in one case, this is, I think, widely spoken about, I don't know if it's a public issue or not, but it should be. If Twitter doesn't respond to the requests or the demands or the instructions, whatever you want to call them, of PTA or the government of Pakistan, what option does that leave the government of Pakistan? So I think what we're seeing, the draconian nature of this, is also rooted, I think, in the state's frustration. So I think Taimur's point is absolutely valid as far as the bad law. It is a bad law. And PECA is a bad law, and these are bad rules. I think there's no doubt about that. But the question we have to answer is not just that we critique this, but we also sort of then propose something different. And I think on the proposal part, civil society and business community both have been pretty weak, right? Because obviously the business would not want to increase its cost of business, but at some level it has to, or rather it has to address why it won't. Otherwise, we're asking too much of all of the parties involved, and we're at a complete, I think, sort of standstill as far as the differing positions. I think that the state's position keeps hardening, partly because we don't really have a good answer. I haven't been able to, when I talk to the big social media companies, I haven't been able to get an answer as to why they're not more responsive.
That raises a really interesting question, and I think the rest of the participants can now we can answer that. We can try and find where we can find that balance where the government, rightfully perhaps in some cases not, rightfully in other cases, wants to at least control content to some extent, particularly if it's harmful. And I'd like to come to you, Usama, with this question. Can we make a comparison with other countries that are trying to control the dissemination of misinformation, disinformation, for instance, related to public health, or posts that are insightful, hate, that related to hate and hate crimes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think Mosharraf also raises some important points about the role of the companies and the role of the government. So let's take a look at what happens in the status quo. So in the absence of these rules, what was happening to harmful content? So you have the internet companies that have community guidelines or different standards that are made in consultation with multi-stakeholder forums over the years, and they're constantly changing. I think a lot of us here have also been part of such recommendations and processes. And civil society organizations globally have been putting a lot of pressure on the companies to do this. But on the other hand, when you come and give this power to the government, so do we really expect for that power to be used effectively? One, and second, the question is that whether there are enough checks and balances on those powers if they are to be given, and if we are to accept this certain censorship power being given to the government. Now, what have we seen? So we've seen that all these companies have transparency reports in which they tell us that how many requests did they get from governments, and how many requests did they comply with on user data, and how many requests did they comply with on content moderation, content related requests from the government. So if you look at the statistics, so in 2019, in the first 6 months, of all the government requests that Facebook received, 33% were from the Pakistani government. So we're seeing that the highest volume of requests that Facebook is receiving, 1/3 of them is coming from one government, which is ours. So does that really show us, it really shows us that to the level or the extent of censorship that the government wants to put in place. So what is really the intent? And then when you look at Google's transparency report, we find out that there was one letter by academics that was signed all over Pakistan asking for the government to not clamp down on academic freedom. And the Pakistani government had sent a request to them asking them to take down that letter from Google Drive. So if you look at the kind of overtures that the government has been trying to make and trying to bully the government into, it's not a very good picture. Whereas I agree, Mosharraf, that Twitter in particular had been problematic in the case where it did not listen to any of the demands of the government. But I think in the latest report, we've seen that I think 30% of requests from the government have been complied to by Twitter. But at the end of the day, do we want these powers to rest with the government? And do we want that kind of abuse of such content or such powers to take place? Now, yes, there's a lot of harmful content that needs to be taken care of. But do we need Section 37 for that or not? So Bolo had actually prepared a very detailed policy brief in July, which we disseminated everywhere. And part of that was the argument where we argued that there are already other sections within PICA that protect citizens against harmful content. So for example, if you look at Section 21, it protects you against your pictures and videos being used in a malicious way. Section 22 deals with pornographic content and child pornography. Section 24 deals with cyber stalking, and all of these sections also stipulate options for the government and the state to ask the social media companies to take down content that is harmful to citizens. Similarly, we see Section 11 of PICA that deals with hate speech and with incitement to violence. So we see a lot of these sections already present in this law. But what Section 37 does is takes that censorship power one step further and really give the government a wide power. And through these rules, we see the language that they've used in order to try to curb, dissent and criticism. And it is very, very clear now that we've seen this language. So I think we need to look at what the existing mechanisms are. How can we improve those further? How can users report content using the mechanisms that are present? Now, Nighat can speak better on this also, but the DRF's helpline already is in touch with a lot of these companies in which content is sent. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say this openly, but I think some government agencies have also been referring cases to the cyber harassment helpline at DRF, because civil society organizations are taking that effort and creating those linkages that are very important in order to moderate content that is harmful. So I think what we're also seeing is a lot of potential of a public-private partnership. And maybe we should talk about that as well. And that's where the idea of checks and balances comes. So why does the PTA have the powers of judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to internet content? Why is there no independent authority? Why can they not involve more stakeholders in this process to make it more inclusive? But at the end of the day, like Mosharraf and Nighat and Taimur and Wahaj have already mentioned, PICA fundamentally is a flawed law in which the intent is to protect the state's interests and not citizens' interests. And we keep seeing more and more evidence that points in that direction.
Response. Thank you for that detailed response, Usama. But so I'm going to take it to Nighat here, because I think, again, it's the same question where how do you regulate harmful content? Who is ultimately responsible? So, for instance, according to this law, ISPs are also responsible for the content when they're just meant to be conduits, as Wahaj Siraj pointed out. On the other hand, we had this discussion in the US as well, because according to a law that was passed in the US several years ago, which is now, Facebook and Twitter, the founders have been within Senate and congressional hearings about this as well. Are they liable for that content? So what are the best practices here, Nighat?
So I think a lot of stuff has already been said by Usama, but I think we really need to also look into the practices around state in terms of rule of law, how strong rule of law is in Pakistan. Or the past practices of not just the current government, but previous governments as well, in terms of removing and blocking content, in terms of activists, journalists by Federal Investigation Agency. And I think there has been an effort to draft different regulations, rules, directives, laws in terms of regulating and controlling internet, instead of focusing on making the existing systems better. For instance, what we have seen in the last 4 years with the designated agency, Federal Investigation Agency, Cybercrime Wing, that there was so much needed to be done by the government and by the respective ministries in terms of how the investigative agency is, accepting or interpreting the law. Which was Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. But what we saw, there was something else on the paper, and the practices were entirely different in terms of taking judicial warrants for taking people's device, or raiding their homes and taking all the devices or content, or even asking the social media companies for taking down contents or asking for users' data. So there is a process that is laid down in the paper, but practically we don't see that process has been followed by them. Under, I think, so Usama, you can correct me if it was section 53 or 54, under which Federal Investigation Agency was supposed to submit their reports with the parliamentary body for the oversight and accountability mechanism that was laid down in Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. And that was, again, the efforts by the civil society, but nothing has been done. So why I'm saying this? Because there was so much that needed to be done, but nothing was. The government didn't really have a focus on the agency and on the regulatory body to sort of build the mechanisms around oversight, accountability, and transparency. Now, coming back to the harmful content, yes, there are several jurisdictions around the world where countries are taking different measures in holding companies accountable. But I would again say that Pakistan, unfortunately, we are maybe on a way to strengthening our democracy and rule of law, but we are not yet there. We don't have data protection legislation. We don't have conducive regulatory framework or environment for companies to come into Pakistan, establish their offices or install their data centers here, which is basically data localization under the same rules. So I think now we have kind of like a choice between state regulating your data or monitoring and surveilling the users in Pakistan, or we prefer companies to look into the data content moderation or taking down the harmful content, as you said. So like choosing which one will be lesser evil. Unfortunately, I'm saying this, but that's the case here. And I think we really need to focus more on strengthening the mechanisms that are already there, but pushing back these companies. For instance, Facebook has this independent oversight board, and I'm a member of oversight board, but I know that how much work the board has been doing to hold the company accountable. So much work, so much energies are going there, and I think companies really need to look into such independent mechanisms that hold these companies accountable, in addition to the governments and states that are doing around the world. Because more regulations, more laws, more, I think they are just not the answer. I think we really need to look into the innovative measures in terms of content moderation. Amber, you are muted. Right?
Can't hear you. You're muted.
We really need to develop these mechanisms better, and what's working isn't quite working, but we may be able to get there. But I think I'd like to turn to you, Wahaj Siraj, because I was just looking at a tweet by Tania Idroos, who was leading the Digital Pakistan initiative, and I thought her reaction was very interesting and very telling. It reflected, in a sense, maybe perhaps what the government was thinking. She said that threats can never lead to sustainable outcomes, and she's referring to the Asia Internet Coalition, which says which tech companies were threatening to leave Pakistan because of these digital rules. And she went on to say that big tech needs to invest time and resources in understanding local sensitivities, but the government also needs to be pragmatic about its demands. What's your reaction to that? So in what sense can the government be more pragmatic, and do threats really work, especially in terms of tech companies?
I think, of course, government needs to have a balance between the business interest, between the citizen interest. The internet users, internet users, and the state institutions. So these are the three things, I think, which the government needs to keep a balance. Unfortunately, the rules and regulations made in this country are primarily used as a tool in the hands of the powerful elite class, whether it is government, or whether it is a political party, or anybody else, to squeeze the opponents. So these rules are actually not applied across the board. Same thing happens with the PICA. Same thing happens with the Pakistan Telecom Act. Same thing happens also, I think, in many other fields as well. Uh, Here, government actually wants the foreign companies to come under these regulations, but they always want to adopt a trigger happy approach. So they kill first and ask for the proofs later. So they say, okay, if you don't do this thing, your site would be blocked. So you will be blacked out, say, from, say, millions of the internet users from Pakistan. And now then you come to the talking table. My question is, why government has miserably failed to engage with the tech giant for doing a constructive dialogue over a period of last many years? Why can't they engage with a Facebook? Why can't they engage with a Twitter? Why can't they engage with a Google at the policy making level to get their inputs and to engage into a constructive dialogue where they keep a balance between the local laws, between the local cultural sensitivities, and between the interest of the local businesses, interest of the foreign businesses, and interest of the consumers? There is a saying that it is easy to make things difficult. It is easy to make things difficult, but it is difficult to make things easy. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, government always find the easy path and they make things difficult for others. I mean, just like blocking of cellular service. I mean, there is a say one protest or say one something. I mean, so anything going on, say in 2 kilometer radius. The easiest thing is to block the entire communication of the whole division or say whole say 300 or 400 square kilometer area. That is the easiest thing that the government does. And it is very easy to block the roads. It is very easy to jam the communication. It is very easy to block the YouTube. It is very easy to block the Facebook in Pakistan. But it is difficult to do something surgical and to do something with the precision and to do something with I mean making people's lives comfortable. So basically, I mean, when PICA was done, there was a clause that FIA would be strengthened. So FIA has a cybercrime wing across the country. So I think they maybe have 10 or 20 offices at the divisional level, but they know nothing. I mean, so they don't have any equipment. They don't have any technical training. Similarly, when these matters are taken to the judicial courts, there is no training of the judges. So there aren't any there is no professional and technical help provided to the judges to make informed decision on the cases related to cybercrime. FIA only does the cases which are high profile cases. Which belong to the opposition parties, which belong to something where government has a keen interest, where ordinary people and ordinary citizens are involved, and even the small and the medium and the large businesses involved. FIA actually does nothing. So even they don't even register an FIR, which they are required to do under the law. So my question is that what Mosharraf has been saying, that of course there has to be rules, there has to be regulations, but I mean what my other colleagues were saying here, that there has to be another body which would which would oversee the content regulation. I mean, for God's sake, we don't need more regulators in this country. We had enough regulators. I mean, everybody is a regulator. Everybody is trying to fleece money from the businesses in the form of the regulatory fee, so taking their blood out and actually making the businesses more difficult. We don't need any more regulator. So I think the government has taken out the national coordinator office, so they have done a good job. So that should have been taken out. PTA is already there. PTA is a quasi-judicial body. I mean, PTA is just not an administrative regulator. So they perform the job of a quasi-judicial body. So they have a 3-member authority. And before PTA was brought into these regulation, so there was an interministerial committee which used to operate under the shadow. So I think so PICA was kind of a one step ahead from the interministerial committee, so it has brought the stuff from the shadow to the limelight, to an regulator established under the statute, under the constitution, with some proper mechanism. We don't need more regulators in this country, for God's sake. I mean, we need less regulations. We need regulations which are implemented across the board. We don't need selective justice. We need justice which is done to the ordinary citizen, and then the justice which is done to the judiciary and which is done up to the highest level. So this is the fundamental problem, I think, which we need to address. The civil society organization, the industry, the users, and the government. So I think I think my suggestion would be that Nighat and Usama, so they are great friends, and we have been together say for last 10-15 years. So I mean, you guys shouldn't have boycotted the consultation. I mean, so we should have been there actually. I mean, the operators were not invited, so we were not there. But we should have been there. We should have raised our voice. We should have presented a balanced view to the regulators, to the decision makers, that look, guys, I mean, you are here to do something which would be there for say next 10-20 years. So we are making some laws, we are making some regulations which would be applied to our next generation. I mean, when the PICA was being formed, so we made this presentation to the then minister, this Madam Anusha Rahman, and we told the minister that ma'am, look, today you are framing these rules with the PTI in mind, because because they used to think that PTI is ruling the social media, and their voice needs to be curbed. So they were trying to do this thing, and we told her that ma'am, when you will be in opposition, the same rules will be applied to you. And same thing has happening. So same thing happened last year. So when government used the PICA to prosecute the leaders of opposition under the Cybercrime Act. So my take is that we, being the informed citizens of Pakistan, we need to keep raising our voices. We need to tell the regulators, we need to keep telling the policymakers that this is something where we are deciding Pakistan's future. We are discussing something which would affect the 60% youth of Pakistan, which are looking towards a prosperous and honorable and digital Pakistan, where they can take their content to the global market. So when say one Pakistani guy sitting in Kasur or sitting in Laya or sitting in DG Khan creates a content, and he is willing to take that content to the American and to the European market. So why do we have a discrimination against the foreign companies who are trying to do some business here? So we want our guys to export, and on the other hand, we want the foreign companies to have a restrictive access in Pakistan. That is not going to happen. We need to provide a level playing field to the foreign companies, to the local companies, to the local entrepreneurs, so that the local entrepreneurs have access to the foreign market, and the foreign companies have access to the Pakistani market.
All right, thank you. I mean, that raises some more questions in my mind as well. And I think you expressed it wonderfully when you said कि बहुत तेजी से चीजों को block तो कर देते हैं. It's very easy. And that's the sort of reaction of any government. And I'm going to sort of take that question to Taimur, because it is easy for the government to control via blocking, whether it's mobile phones, whether it's putting containers up on roads in order to prevent protests, whether it's blocking an entire channel, YouTube, for instance, an entire app, which so many people had raised their voice against. It took several years for the government to unblock it once certain conditions were in place. I mean, but here's the question, Taimur. Is it possible to judge the intent of a law? Is it possible? Can we make that judgment call, and is it fair?
Taimur, you'll have to unmute.
I don't think so, Amber. I don't think it's about the intent of this government or any particular government. I think it's an issue with us as a society. All of us, including the six of us, are responsible for this. Just to take Wahaj Saab's point, I think boycotting is never an answer in any context. Of course, Nighat and Usama have played a very important role in this entire thing, so it's not about them. But when we are part of the process, it's a responsibility as well, especially when other 220 million people around us are not informed citizens, to use Wahaj Saab's words. So that's what I believe in. I think if we are where we are today, it's more a reflection of perhaps lack of a process and the failures of our democratic system as well. So if this same law, or in this case the delegated legislation, was passed through discussions and debate at the parliament, then we'll have the parliamentarians to blame, and the parliament can pass any law. So, and then it's for the courts to decide whether it's constitutional or not. In this particular case, I would further go on to say that I think if not much has changed from the previous version of the rules, then maybe it's an overzealous act of whoever was sitting on these rules, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they have ill intent. I think it's a matter of engaging people, of discussing different aspects, things which don't work and which will work, and trying to find a way which will work to the best extent possible for everybody involved. In our case, I think we all want some harmful content to be taken off. Perhaps I don't want extremism in this country. I don't want my kids to grow up in that kind of environment, for example. Others may have a different view about what they consider to be harmful, content. National security interests are important for a country like Pakistan, whether we like it or not. Unfortunately, in many ways, we are a national security state. But that doesn't mean that we should not look at what are the current requirements of the world and the people of Pakistan, the youth of Pakistan. So education, technology, ed tech, health tech, legal tech, they're all very important, and they can't they can't blossom. If internet speed are further reduced, if the costs of accessing internet are increased, as seems to be the case by speaking to people like Wahaj, all these things. So hence there needs to be a balance. We need to consider, are we in a position to develop our healthcare and education infrastructures with the speed that's required now, or are we to rely on information technology for moving forward and becoming a first world country eventually? And for that, this is important. So these social media rules should not be looked just from the lens of whoever is looking at them for blocking of content. I think whether they realize it or not, or intentional or unintentional, but the consequences would be disrupting the growth of e-commerce, of health tech, ed tech, of startups that we are seeing in Pakistan today, and also foreign investment in these startups. So we don't want to be at a situation where the digital Pakistan dream of this government, but I would say of the people of Pakistan, takes a hit before it's even taken off. So that's my point of view. I don't think it's about intent. I think engagement is important with all stakeholders. I think it's lack of engagement at times which results in positions that are untenable and unsustainable for all parties involved.
All right. Thank you. Yes, Mosharraf. Wahaj Saab has also talked about it. Taimur has also talked about it. But I think particularly I want you to answer this question. Given COVID-19, given the pandemic, given lockdowns, given the economic recession, not just in Pakistan, but all over the world, this was actually a key moment where we could have tapped into the opportunities available digitally. Do you think that these particular rules or this moment is going to interfere with that dream of digital Pakistan?
Well, I think the dream of digital Pakistan, I really loved how Taimur Malik just framed this, right? This isn't one person's dream. It's not one person's agenda. And it doesn't belong to anyone. I think digital Pakistan arrived in this country, and when IRC or ICQ or MIRC, those chat groups started, and that was a generation ago, right? That was the late 1990s, and people who were the same age as me, teenage women, for example, or young women, for the first time had access to, across classes, had access to people beyond their immediate circle. It was the first instance of mass mobility. The government couldn't regulate that, and the government's not really going to be able to regulate or suppress content now. I think what's really happening, and the point about engagement is absolutely right. After the consultation with the PTA was done, I called Nighat, and we spent a long time on the phone with me trying to understand the position of the boycott. I don't want to prosecute that. I think any civil society rights group is well within its right in this country to actually say, you know what, I'm done with consultations that don't mean anything. And really, in terms of the content of the rules, I didn't really speak that much when I was engaged with the PTA, because really what I was trying to convince them to do was to engage. So my pitch to the PTA and publicly and privately is really the same as in any case. At least with an open heart, start talking to those people who are criticizing. koi gali shali deta, people start cursing or whatever, shut them out. Just stop talking to them. But people who are professional, who are writing policy briefs like Bolo B, like the Asad Media Matters for Democracy, like Digital Rights Foundation. I mean, we don't have just one. We have 4 or 5 really fantastic, digitally focused rights groups in this country. Facebook talks to them. Twitter talks to them. Nighat is a global superstar, right? She's on the World Economic Forum's YGL. She's a TED fellow. I mean, there isn't one freedom forum on the planet that Nighat hasn't been celebrated by. And really, if you start to think about this in terms that are more uncomfortable, I think a lot of people don't talk about this. How many people at PTA or within the state machinery at the Ministry of IT are invited to the Oslo Freedom Forum? How many of those people know people who are organizing those events? How many of their friends, cousins, first or second network degrees of separation within that network are working at Facebook or on Silicon Valley? You have a substantial capacity gap within the Pakistani state that is purely a product of now a generation and a half of top shelf talent, Pakistani talent, that is eschewing working for the state, whether it's working in the military, working in the bureaucracy, working on the ex-cadre positions across various agencies like NAB or PTA or OGRA. And so what you end up with is a regulatory function being executed by individuals that don't have the capacity or the confidence to deal with a Nighat. I mean, dealing with Nighat, dealing with Usama Khilji requires some degree of capacity. Nighat has gone and memorized Pekka and half of the Constitution so that she can argue her case better. The person sitting across the table from her cannot expect to be respected just because they're old, or because they're super religious, or because they believe they're more patriotic than Nighat. When the Pakistani state engages, and I keep picking on Nighat because she's clearly, with respect to everyone on the panel, the absolute superstar among us. We need to have a Pakistani state. So for me, I want a strong Pakistani state. I do think hate speech should be controlled. I think there's plenty of other kinds of deliberately insightful material that there should be some degree of mechanism that we can address that kind of thing with. When I want that, who do I want fighting my case? If the other side, let's say the other side is the evil West, which I don't think it is, but let's say it is. So who do we want engaging with the evil West? Do we want somebody who doesn't know how to speak their language, can't convince them of anything, and is not respected by them? Or do we want people who have that capacity? And so for me, one of the big policy questions around this is the capacity of the Pakistani state to get what it wants. Not all of it is about state control. I'll say this too. There's lots of people who write to PTA every day who are sick and tired of their sons and daughters on TikTok, who are sick and tired of PUBG addiction, who are sick and tired of their own addictions to Ludo 2 or what have you, Ludo Star 2, which is one of my recent ones. So I think there is a public demand. How big it is, it's hard to say. And so the state is not just wanting to control speech, it also is responding as a democratic state should, to what people want. What we need are people on the other side who can process this and plug it into the global discourse with Facebook and Twitter, and do so with some respect for our Constitution. And so really, the responsibility is on the state to strap up its boots and become better at the things it should be doing and it claims it's doing.
The responsibility is on the state. And we've talked about a few preconditions as well. Usama, if you could answer this question. I know that we keep coming back to that boycott as well. If you want to answer that, respond to that as well, because Nighat did, feel free to. But I also want to add another question here. When we talk about preconditions to these rules, Wahaj Saab talked about the FIA, strengthening FIA, et cetera. We also know that the data protection or privacy, citizens' privacy, those laws haven't been put into effect as well. That's somewhere in cold storage as well. If you could respond to that as well in terms of what should have been the preconditions, even if we object to the way the consultations were done and you boycotted it, even if we object to the actual framing of the rules as well. What are some of the other preconditions, and how could those have been tracked or monitored, or at least talked about, or should have been?
Yes, so I agree that engagement is very important. And we must all engage with whoever wants to engage with us, especially on topics of importance such as internet related rules. But I think Taimur already very well explained the legal issue of a cabinet notifying rules in February and then not really de-notifying them and calling a consultation just because the prime minister said that we're suspending those rules, which does not have any legal basis. So if the Mustafa Impacts case is looked at, it clearly states that the prime minister cannot overrule a decision of the federal cabinet. So our boycott was really rooted in that legal reasoning as well, where we said we need legal clarity from the government. How can you have a consultation on rules that are notified, never de-notified? And I had a conversation with the federal cabinet minister about this, and the explanation I got was, "Oh, it's easier to suspend them." But democracy and the government, like Wahaj Saab said, it's easy to do things that make things hard for others, but also it's easier to do something that's illegal, which is the prime minister trying to overrule a cabinet's notification. So I don't think it's acceptable or ethically, morally, legally for civil society to engage in a dialogue that is fundamentally legally flawed. But then also, it's very important to remember that the companies did engage with the PTA. Facebook had separate meetings with the PTA. I think Google had meetings with them, and there was consultation. But did we see any of that reflected in the second draft? No, it was an eyewash, and it was very obvious. Now, I know a lot of civil society members were invited for the consultation in advance, but I should also put on the record that Bolo got an invitation at the night before the meeting, which was the next day. So I think it's also very important for us to consider how these processes and consultations are taking place. Are they legal or not? What is the intent? Are they following due process? Are they inviting people in time? And are they really taking the feedback? And to repeat what Nighat already mentioned earlier, what we've a lot of times seen is that they will write down your name, say, "Oh, we consulted these people," but at the end of the day, the feedback is not really taken into account of the draft that you see, and that's exactly what we've seen happen this time as well with the companies. So I think, and then when you take back and what Nighat already mentioned, when you look at Section 37, which is a fundamentally flawed section, and we have been engaging with the Parliament. So the Human Rights Committee of the National Assembly, it's already on their agenda to revise Section 20 and 37 of PICA, which we think are fundamentally flawed and do not have constitutional basis. So it's important to set the record straight on that. And then going back to Amber, you spoke about privacy concerns, and you spoke about the processes around this law. So I think there are some very important concerns about that. So do we want the state to have access to a lot of the data that they want access to, right? And then secondly, sorry, Amber, can you repeat your second part of the question, because I got carried away with the response to the first.
Yes. The question that I had asked really was some of the preconditions. So you can specifically, if you'd like, talk about the data protection law that seems to be nowhere at the moment. And that perhaps should have been a precondition before these rules as well, and I want to talk about data localization with Nighat after this as well. So we can take that conversation there.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very pertinent point, because if you're asking the companies to set up databases, and you don't have a data protection or privacy law, but I would give this to the government that in the rules they did mention, subject to data protection law, set up database servers. And we've seen a draft of the data protection and privacy law come up earlier this year in March, on which they invited consultation. And I would also add that Bolo, DRF, and a lot of other organizations have submitted feedback on those laws. And there are some very good aspects of the law, and some were missing, primarily because the data protection law did not really cover data held by the government, which is, as we know, the biggest holder of data as we know it. So we have submitted feedback on that bill to the government, and we're expecting to hear back from them. I think DRF already had a meeting with them after that. So in that, they are following some sort of process, which is great. But I think one demand that we should also keep, and this goes for businesses, for civil society, and for others, is to demand that, okay, when the government does hold a consultation, then they should justify not inculcating the feedback into the next draft. So if they do take in some feedback, that's great. But if they don't, the least they should do is give a justification as to this is the reason why this feedback has not been taken into account into this draft. But going back to data protection and privacy, I think what we see is, Nadra database was hacked, I think 2 or 3 times already in the past few years. The Punjab IT board database was hacked once or twice. So what we're seeing is that there's no really legal protection for the data that is held by the government, by private companies, and by others. And, just small things like telecom, it's very easy to access data with telecom companies. And there's no really legal avenue for us to go and complain against that. So that needs to be there. And that's what this law is seeking to bring in. But at the end of the day, the companies will not set up database servers if they're not, I think already the practice is that for your companies that are based in Europe, they will only engage with other governments if their data protection laws are as good or better than the GDPR in Europe. So these standards already exist globally. And, this is a golden opportunity for the Pakistani government to work on a robust data protection law and implement it justly so that the companies do come in and do invest here and do work here. And, one more thing, when you do bring in stringent conditions, some companies will divest also. And we've seen this, I think, in the example of Bangladesh, where a telecom company, international telecom company, divested because of bad laws being made over there. And we've seen a lot of investment, billions of dollars of investment in employment by telecom companies in Pakistan also, and by IT companies. So if the government does go in the right direction and set up a good, robust data protection, legal framework, then I think it'll be great for the economy, where you'll see more investment, where you'll see more business, and you'll see more innovation also taking place, like Wahaj Saab has already spoken about.
All right, Nighat, if I could talk to you about data localization, why, what is it exactly, and why could it potentially be a problem?
So under the same rules, basically the authority is seeking social media companies, or if you look at the definition of social media company, there are like number of organizations or individuals who basically come under that definition. So they are seeking them to install their databases server data servers here in Pakistan within 3 months of being these rules being notified. I think the problem is again that Usama mentioned that there is no data protection law in Pakistan. And yes, that was something that the government should have been focused before initiating the process around these rules. But now we have seen that in recent weeks, there was a draft that was introduced last year. But then again, there was another draft which was much better than the previous one. But still, there were a number of challenges that we raised with the IT ministry last month. At the same time, I think, again, the issue of consultation and engagement, because they invited us and they didn't invite others from the digital rights organizations or civil society organization. I'm not sure if ISPs were invited. Wahaj Saab can respond to that. But we were invited very close to the consultation that they wanted to do. But we told them, we told them that we have already submitted our recommendations on the draft that was published on the Ministry of IT website. And they said, we have received your recommendation, but we want to speak to the digital rights organizations. There were a number of issues with the current draft. And during the consultation, I think the IT ministry's intention around data protection is in a right place, but I think they are also dealing with number of challenges and hurdles in terms of accommodating the recommendations of different stakeholders. So we don't know how the final draft will look like, but at the moment, I think we don't know the status of the data protection law, and that basically raises a concern around data localization, that until or unless the draft is out there, or like people have already, like enough people have been consulted on the draft, or they pass the law, until then they cannot push the provision around data localization mentioned in the rules, so which is at least a better thing in the rules around data localization.
So I'll just take that question to Wahaj Saab. I think it's important because if we want to improve the way that these laws are made, if we want stakeholders to be involved, and I think the data protection laws are pretty key at this point. Wahaj Saab, have ISPs, have you been consulted?
No, I mean, we have not been consulted. I mean, my take is that there is a task force of the Prime Minister on IT and telecom. And I think that has 23 members, comes from the IT industry, come from the software houses, come from the academia and the telecom industry. None of the members of the task force in their individual and the collective capacity were ever consulted for these rules or even the data protection law. The clause of the localization of the data is actually very funny. I mean, so I think that is a technical laughing stock. It says that subject to the promulgation of data protection law, so at least government is serious in implementing data protection law. That's a good thing. Establish one or more database servers in Pakistan within 18 months of coming into force. One or more database servers. I mean, the social media companies have hundreds and thousands of the servers spread across the globe. So one server means nothing practically, and this actually goes squarely against their previous direction, where they wanted the CDNs to come under the blocking. So they were saying that the Facebook is complying on blocking on blocking some content which is hosted elsewhere outside Pakistan, but because CDNs are hosted within Pakistan, so that content is available in the cache for say maybe 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 hours. And you need to block that as well. So on the CDN side, government says that block the CDNs, and so which are hosted locally. Here they are saying that the social media company would bring one of its server out of say 1 million server in Pakistan and host a database. I mean, so that means actually nothing. So this is something which come back to the fundamental stuff, that who is the master draftsman of these rules actually. So that is actually so I think quite unfortunate that the guys who have put their pen or their keyboard on these rules, actually I think they are totally disconnect, and that brings the fundamental, I think, point that the Mosharraf has rightly pointed out. We need serious capacity building with our regulators. I mean, so we need great guys to be there. So and if there aren't any great guys working in the government, at least they should get some good guys from the civil society, from the private sector, to sit with them and to engage and to make some meaningful drafts which actually does not make Pakistan a laughing stock in front of the international internet community. My question is that PTA is very well represented in the international telecom union. They are part of that. They are represented at AYANA. They are represented at ICANN. So they attend their meetings regularly, which which are held, I think, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times across the globe. So they attend those meetings. What stops them to get engaged with the Google or with the Facebook and with the Twitter and with the TikTok in a meaningful, constructive way? So I think that mindset needs to be changed. So we need to come out of those mindset that oh, public demand, public is saying, the parents are saying that PUBG needs to be blocked. I mean, that is absurd. I mean, this is something, and that is just a gaming. I mean, gaming app. So so nothing to do with the legality, illegality. So popular demand, because parents are trigger happy, they want their children to maybe spend time on playing Pitugaram or playing Bante, the old age games. So they say PUBG to be blocked. I mean, so that actually shows the mindset. So this is something that needs to be changed. So mindset needs to be changed. That, look, guys, I mean, we are entering into the 2021, and we want Pakistan to be a dignified, honorable, and prosperous country into this global market.
Hmm.
We want our businesses to prosper. We want our youth to have a meaningful job. So we need to have some. So I think decency, I would say, some decency and some deep thinking into the regulation, into the policy making, into the regulations, into the law making, that what we are making. I mean, so and those should not be, I mean, kind of a impulsive decisions, that's something that I don't like, or something that Mosharraf doesn't like.
All right. I think really passionately said as well, Wahaj Saab. And I think we all feel passionately about this because it impacts everything that we do. Taimur, but here's the question. And I think you asked this, Wahaj Saab has also asked this. I mean, I wonder if we'll find out who actually drafted these rules and what will happen to them. But just, that jokes aside, how do we prevent misuse? Because they're here. These rules have been notified. They're out there. How do we prevent the government from misusing these rules, the PTA from misusing these rules?
These needs to be challenged, first of all. And I think I'm pretty sure, in fact, that somebody or the other will challenge them soon. So that's one way of preventing their misuse, that they will not exist for a very long time. And on that, let me mention a few more technical legal points. The delegated legislation needs to follow, the powers that are available under the primary legislation to make such rules. I feel, and I've discussed it with many other lawyers over the last few days, that these rules are not properly notified. They go beyond the powers that are there in the primary legislations. The other thing is that the creation of offenses that has been done under these rules, it also goes beyond the mandate of a delegated rule making of this nature. The third thing is that even otherwise, the quantum of some of the fines, like it's I think 500 million rupees. The primary legislation, with all its flaws, the fines range from a few 100,000 to perhaps 10 million for something. So that too, the arbitrariness and the disproportionate nature of the fine, this is all going to be called into question from a legal perspective. And my position remains, I think it's not about just trying to work with these rules. It is important that, and it's not a blame game. Whoever has done these, drafted these, we should have an informed discussion with them so that things can improve. As I said earlier, it's not about ill intent, in my opinion. It's perhaps lack of capacity, as everybody has said, and lack of perhaps resources being made available. I think there are many people who would like to contribute to this kind of rule making in the future. So that's the way forward. I think capacity building of judges to look at these aspects is very important. At the Punjab Judicial Academy and the Federal Judicial Academy level, already there have been training sessions in which many people have taken part in relation to how to adjudicate matters related to cybercrime and so on. I completely agree regarding the data protection bill, which is still pending and is an important element that for the national company, but also for our local players. Having said that, I think another key thing is that we need to broaden the group that engages with the stakeholders. At times, if it's only Taimur or Mosharraf raising the same points and again, there can be a fatigue that can set in with the stakeholders. In this case, perhaps, and we should really acknowledge the work that DRF and Bolo and Media Matters do. It takes a long time to create organizations and voices like these. and I hope they continue. So, but it could be that it's only these people that that the stakeholders are seeing, and they probably think this is not a widespread issue. So I would encourage anybody listening to this discussion today, that if you feel passionate about it, if you feel that these rules hamper Pakistan's future growth potential when it comes to technology, these would hamper internet access or the speed of internet and the access to internet, then you should raise informed, reasoned arguments with the stakeholders, with PTA, in the form that you can. That's what I would say, Amber.
All right. So you think that there's potential for these rules to be challenged. Usama and Nighat, it's the same question for you. How do we prevent misuse? On what forum do we challenge? And how do we include more voices as well? Usama.
No, very good question. What's the future like? So I think if the government is sincere about empowering people and wants a digital Pakistan that's inclusive and democratic, then they should take back these rules before people have to challenge them in court. If the opposition is serious about their chance about democracy, then they should use the function of the parliament to amend PICA and to improve their oversight of these processes, including the delegated legislation that's taking place under these rules. And of course, the courts must also step in to protect fundamental rights, like it's their job to do so, as far as these rules are concerned. So I think we already have, our legal system, and that's the beauty of our constitution and the democratic system, that you have a system of checks and balances if something goes wrong. And I think that has to be inculcated at every step of policy making and lawmaking. I think as far as the judiciary is concerned, DRF and Bolo, we've been involved in and with the judiciary. We've been doing capacity building and training of judges, lower judiciary as well as higher judiciary. And I think there needs to be, a more formal procedure of that. So perhaps making it part of the curriculum for judges would be a good start. But then as far as these rules are concerned, like Taimur said, in the current form, we can expect the internet to fundamentally change in Pakistan, including a lot of platforms not being available to Pakistani users. A very similar situation to what we have in China. But I think that's not possible in Pakistan because of the nature of our government, our system, as well as the plurality of voices and the commitment to resistance. I'm going
to stop you there, Usama, because I wanted Nighat to have a say, and Mosharraf. We want you to sort of wrap up on this as well, because capacity is something that's really important. Nighat, moving forward, you have about a minute.
Yeah, I think I'll be very quick. I think we cannot build on the wrong foundation, and these rules need to go. And we really need to look into the flaws in the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act and address those flaws first. And I think we haven't developed good jurisprudence around prevention of electronic crime. So that again goes back to the question around how much your judiciary or your judges in the trial courts are aware of such legislation or around internet governance. But at the same time, we cannot act as a government or state in an isolation. We have signed and ratified international human rights law treaties and conventions, and so I think we really need to look into those international human rights laws while drafting such regulations, because if we really want to be part of the tech global community, we have to look into the wider global international human rights sphere as well.
All right, Mosharraf, if you could respond in the end as well. I think capacity is something that's come up. That's a strong case for building capacity. Who does it? I mean, international NGOs or local NGOs have a limited capacity to build capacity.
Well, and it's not really their job. I think that we need to be clear about whose responsibility this is and what is a trusted way of doing this. And there's only one way to do this. The state, meaning the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and in this case, the government of Pakistan, needs to respond to the capacity gaps that exist. But this sounds hollow and empty, because not long ago, Ismail Shah was the chairperson of the PTA, widely seen as a technically capable and broadly reasonable person. That doesn't mean that the current chairperson is not a reasonable person, but in terms of who we have running these organizations, and then within the organizations, the people that work there, you cannot expect them to be able to negotiate better positions even if we accept that so many Pakistani parents don't want PUBG, right? And you see, I think that position deserves the mockery that Wahaj was giving it, because you saw how quickly that position was reversed. And that's really the point here. The point is that in Urdu, we always used to say, growing up, we used to hear our elders say, "Apni izzat apne haath." The first social media rules were put out there and essentially withdrawn without being denotified. These rules have been notified. Taimur is confident. I'm not as confident it'll be as quick as the previous instance, but these will be changed. The interesting thing is that in all of this, we forget how much difference there is between the February notification and the current rules. There's been a substantial improvement, and I think to acknowledge that, or rather to not acknowledge it, would be unfair. But it shouldn't be this hard, and it shouldn't take this long. February to November, we took almost the entire year. Throughout the year, we had multiple press releases from the AIC and various other companies constantly, essentially criticizing Pakistan for things that Pakistan was doing. If you are a patriot and you care about Pakistan and you value the specifically Pakistani values, whether it's Islam or whether it's, the family system, traditional values, then it is incumbent on you to demand better performance from the government of Pakistan, to do the things that the government of Pakistan constitutionally is responsible for, instead of embarrassing Pakistan like this. So I think we need to encourage government for what it's done, which is it's responded to some aspects of the criticism, and we need to demand the government to do much more to meet the civil society activists and the private sector at least halfway. And this is not halfway. This is a long way from halfway.
Well, thank you. We've run out of time. And I think the upshot of this is there is hope. It can be challenged, and there is still potential for engagement. And we probably need to broaden the engagement to help the government understand as well why these rules are of particular concern. Thank you so much, Mosharraf, Taimur, Wahaj, Nighat, and Usama, for giving us so much of your time on this Sunday. Khudafis.